The current graphics card pricing puts buyers on NVIDIA's lineup into a weird predicament where the 5060 Ti 16GB and the 5070, which has 12GB, aren't that different in price, which means the same buyer might be looking at both of these cards and wondering, should I go for more performance with the 5070 or go for more VRAM with the 5060 Ti 16GB? And I know some people are going to be screaming at their screens about, look at the AMD options with the 9070 16GB. I already did in separate videos, so take a look at those, and I'm doing additional updated head-to-head comparisons if I haven't updated the comparison of the specific GPUs you're looking for. Stay tuned to the channel. Anyway, the point is here that this is something people might be encountering. And at the settings we're looking at here, the 16GB are actually, paying off a bit for the 5060 Ti 16GB. Resident Evil Requiem at its max preset plus RT high does try to allocate more than 12GB of VRAM, which causes the 12GB 5070 to have to use more system memory, and accessing system memory is slower than accessing the GPU memory directly on the GPU with the VRAM, and that slows things down. So in this case, the 5070 is only 11% faster, but that's not typical. What you're seeing here is, what if I kick on DLSS balance? This lowers the internal rendering resolution of the game, which uses slightly less VRAM. Now, the 5070 is 27% faster, which is more like what you would expect from a typical performance difference between these two GPUs. You can see that now even the 16GB card isn't trying to go over 12GB of VRAM, and so that's helping the 5070 hit its normal performance advantage over the 5060 Ti 16GB. So this is an example of what you can see in some of the latest games. Yes, at their max settings, at 1440p, at settings that are reasonable to consider using, you can go over 12GB of VRAM, but usually only some very minor settings tweaks, maybe using a bit more upscaling or turning down textures slightly. Certain graphic settings can just gain you that slight little bit of VRAM, and it gets you back to where you would want to be. Now, in the actual specific price difference between these cards in the US market, at least, I know worldwide can be different, the 5060 Ti 16GB is $570 for the lowest price models, and then it goes up from there, at least the models that are actually in stock. Whereas for the 5070s, today I found a couple right at $600, but I'll say that that's atypical. Usually you're seeing $630 and up, which is where most of the models are at. So one way to look at this comparison is kind of a performance per dollar perspective, but then how do you factor in that VRAM, right? That's really what this video is about. And like I said, the AMD comparisons will be addressed separately because honestly, some people are just going to be like, look, I just want to stick with NVIDIA. Do I get this one or get that one? That's who this video is catered to. There's other ones with the other comparisons. So overall in my testing, and this is completely updated testing, and this is focusing on games released in 2026 or a few of the popular games released in 2025. So we're looking at fresh games, which will be like, the most demanding, most likely to maybe use a lot more VRAM, all of that. And I'm seeing that the 5070 geo-mean averages out to 26% faster than the 5060 Ti 16GB, but you can certainly see some outlier results where it has less of a performance advantage, and those are frequently situations where the game is wanting to go over 12GB of VRAM, so it absolutely is causing a problem. Now, when you're looking at that, though, it can be helpful to see, but was that at settings that I would actually want to use anyway? So if we look at this is the average FPS for each GPU in each of these tests. I'm using red for the 5070 and green for the 5060 Ti 16GB. And one thing I wanted to do with my testing that might be a little different than what you see with a lot of other channels is, rather than focusing on testing a billion games where they're all at like their ultra settings, I like to test a good number of games. I think we got like 9 or 10 games here all released in the last year. But I try to test out multiple settings on each game, where I look at the max setting, but also the max setting with upscaling. And I also look at some sort of reduced overall graphics preset at both native and with upscaling, because that can look at more like how people might actually play the games. And also, especially when VRAM could be an issue, sometimes the card with more VRAM has a bigger advantage when you're at max settings native resolution, but if those aren't the settings you would actually use and you would actually turn things down a bit to get more actual performance, then the performance difference swings the other way. So that's what I'm focusing on doing here, is trying to get a broad variety of tests in each game. At max settings, a reduced preset, as well as native resolution and upscaling for both of those preset choices. And as you can see here, in general, the 5070's red bar is significantly higher than the green bar, right? And we can see that when those gaps are, closing a bit, oftentimes that's happening at places where the overall frame rates are a bit lower. But I still think that digesting a big bar graph like this can still be a little bit hard to process. So the plan for the rest of the video here is I actually want to look through each of these tests in more detail as a side-by-side comparison so you can kind of process what we're seeing, and then come back at the end for my final thoughts on should you spend a bit extra money to get less VRAM but more performance based on all of this testing. All right, so let's start out with what's so far the biggest release of 2026. This is Resident Evil Requiem at 1440p max settings plus path tracing with DLSS balance kicking in. And I do think we could be seeing some issues with the 12GB card because we would normally expect more than a 21% advantage, but it is still a 21% advantage. It's hitting a 51 FPS average, which is a lot more usable than the 42 FPS on the 5060 Ti 16GB, and I'd rather use 50-ish FPS as a baseline to kick on some frame gen and smooth things out than I would 40, so that's the win there for the 5070, even if I may or may not have actually used the path tracing preset there. It's kind of borderline. At max settings, native resolution, but not path tracing, it's RT high, we definitely see us go over 12GB of VRAM, but the 5070 still stays ahead by 11%. Now, sometimes you can see texture issues pop up or some stutters pop up in games where this is happening. Notice the 1% lows are not really an advantage on the 5070 there, so it's a little bit less smooth of an experience, but kicking on DLSS balanced now gets the 5070 up to its 27% advantage, which again is closer in line to that 26% average geo mean, which is what we would expect from a typical result here. So it's no sign of the VRAM capacity causing problems here, and it's 95 FPS versus 75, so both GPUs give a good experience at these settings, but the 5070 definitely gives a better experience at these settings. Now, if we go ahead and go to a reduced preset, this is the normal preset, kind of like a medium settings preset, and turning ray tracing off. At native resolution, we're getting 109 FPS versus 84, which is a 30% advantage for the 5070. So again, you would prefer the additional performance here to the additional VRAM on the 5060 Ti 16GB. Jumping ahead, if we look at Pragmata, if we try to do path tracing on the maximum preset with DLSS balance, the 5070 is 31% faster at a 59 FPS average. It's actually pretty usable here for a single player game, although the more open areas dipped around 50 FPS, which is what you're seeing at this current stage in the little benchmark pass that I do. So usable path tracing settings here on the 5070, and I definitely prefer the extra performance. At the non-pathed maximum preset, this is native resolution. Quality is just the name of the preset. This is not quality upscaling, and this does include ray tracing. The 12GB card seems fine with a 31% advantage at 101 FPS versus 77. If we kick on DLSS balanced, it's now 132 FPS versus 105, which is a 26% advantage for the 5070. And if we use the balanced preset at native resolution, balanced is the name of the preset. It's more like a medium settings preset, and it does turn off the game's ray tracing. We're still seeing the 5070 at a 30% advantage at 118 FPS versus 91. And if you kick on balanced level upscaling on the balanced graphics preset, we're now hitting 146 FPS versus 118. The 5070 has a 24% performance lead, which dropped a little bit. Now, it's possible as you start to get to higher frame rates that you start to see some underlying system limitations, even though I'm using a 9800X 3D here and all of that, where sometimes a GPU just struggles to stretch to its full performance advantage as you just start to reach other system limitations at moments within your benchmark pass. Taking another look at a path tracing benchmark, this is Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p RT overdrive with DLSS balanced, and in the built-in benchmark, the 5070 does get 60 FPS average, which is 28% faster than the 5060 Ti 16GB at 47. Now, there are sections of the game where sometimes VRAM can become a bit of an issue, but you can always tweak settings, and with the balance level upscaling, it usually holds up pretty well. Now, with Forza Horizon 6 at the maximum preset at native resolution, this is extreme preset plus the RT, at all of the max RT settings, it's 52 FPS versus 44. The 5070 is 18% faster. Now, that's not the big lead that we would expect, and there's some signs of this going over 12 gigabytes of VRAM at times. So this is a situation where I think the 5070 is being a little bit held back by its VRAM capacity, although sometimes games just scale kind of weirdly, especially the Forza games, so it might just be a game where we just architecturally just don't get as big of a lead here, even if it's not VRAM related. I tried kicking on DLSS balance to see if that changed anything, and it got the 5070 to a 19% advantage at 81 FPS versus 68. So both are getting a good experience here. Yeah, I'm not seeing them go over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but they're right on that borderline. So yeah, maybe this is a game where you just don't see a ton of scaling versus it being an actual VRAM issue, but it's definitely on that borderline. At the extreme settings, but without any ray tracing at native 1440p, it's 93 FPS versus 79. That's an 18% advantage for the 5070. And again, it doesn't seem to be VRAM related why we're having less of an advantage than usual at these settings, because it's looking like 10 gigabytes of VRAM actually being allocated here. And so with that in mind, it seems like Forza Horizon 6 might just not give a big scaling advantage to the 5070 compared to what some other games do. At the 1440p extreme settings plus DLSS balanced, I got 113 FPS versus 99, which was a 14% advantage for the 5070. In Crimson Desert, at its max settings plus ray reconstruction at native resolution, neither GPU does well. It's 20 FPS versus 15. However, that is a 33% advantage for the 5070. If I kick on DLSS balanced, it goes up to 44 FPS versus 34, which is a 29% advantage to the 5070. We're not seeing any signs of VRAM being an issue here, only seeing around 7 or so gigabytes being allocated. At 1440p ultra settings, we're seeing 73 FPS versus 56. So here, definitely a case where the 30% performance advantage for the 5070 would be preferable to the additional VRAM, and we are nowhere near 12 gigabytes of VRAM, again, hanging out closer to 7. Using DLSS balanced on the Ultra preset gets us to 90 FPS versus 70, 29% advantage to the 5070, and again, no sign that we're anywhere near 12 gigabytes of VRAM being a limiting factor. Call of Duty Black Ops 7 has a extreme preset plus RT high plus ray reconstruction preset that might be going over 12 gigabytes of VRAM. However, it also is only hitting 46 FPS versus 35, so 31% advantage to the 5070, and these are not the settings that you would use in this kind of game at all, because those are not frame rates you want in a competitive multiplayer environment. Settings more like what you might actually use, so 1440p balanced preset at native resolution, it's 178 FPS versus 143, 24% advantage to the 5070. And if we use DLSS balanced on the balanced preset, it's now 193 FPS versus 161, which is a 20% advantage to the 5070. At Battlefield 6 1440p overkill settings, we're seeing 92 FPS versus 69, and while 69 is nice, the 5070 is 33% faster, and we're not seeing signs of 12 gigabytes being a limiting factor here. If I kick DLSS balanced onto that overkill preset, we're now 129 FPS versus 98, which is a 32% advantage for the 5070. And again, no signs of 12 gigabytes being a limiting factor here. At 1440p medium settings, which might be more like how you would play this as a competitive multiplayer game, it's 145 FPS versus 110. That's a 32% advantage for the 5070. And if we kick on 1440p medium settings with DLSS balanced upscaling, it's 185 FPS versus 144. That's a 28% advantage for the 5070. In Marvel Rivals, to take a look at another multiplayer title, 1440p Ultra, 71 FPS versus 55 is a 29% advantage for the 5070 and no signs of VRAM being an issue. With DLSS balanced on the 1440p Ultra preset, it's 108 FPS versus 88, 23% advantage for the 5070 with no signs of VRAM being an issue. And 1440p medium settings native resolution, it's 118 FPS versus 87, 36% advantage for the 5070 with no signs of VRAM being an issue. And at 1440p medium DLSS balanced, it is 171 FPS versus 132, 30% advantage to the 5070 with, once again, no sign of VRAM being an issue. Clair, last year's Game of the Year, 1440p epic settings are pretty hard to run at native resolution. We're getting 48 FPS versus 37. It's a 30% advantage to the 5070 and no signs of 12 gigabytes of VRAM being an issue, although we're definitely over 8. And then if we kick on DLSS balanced on the Epic preset, we're now at 78 FPS versus 64, 22% lead for the 5070, and again, no sign of VRAM being an issue. At 1440p native, but at medium preset, it's now 82 FPS versus 65, which is a 26% advantage for the 5070. And at 1440p medium settings with DLSS balanced, it's all the way up to 119 FPS versus 101, which is a 18% advantage for the 5070, and once again, no sign of VRAM being an issue. All right, that is all of the tests that I ran for this updated look at the 5070 versus the 5060 Ti 16GB. And like I said, overall, the 5070 averages 26% faster. We see a handful of cases where we're going over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but very, very minor tweaks to the graphics settings, like just using some upscaling if you were at native, or sometimes you can tweak a texture setting or something like that down just one notch to gain back a little bit of headroom, and then it seems to be fine. Now, for more long-term thinking, the number of games that could go over 12 gigabytes at their upper level presets will probably grow, especially as we move into the next console cycle, which is probably coming within the next year or two. As you get PS6 games, the PS6 will probably have a lot more than 12 gigabytes of memory that it'll allocate to VRAM related tasks, which might correspond then to the maximum presets in upcoming titles. And so I would imagine that the number of games that would want to have more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM for the maximum presets is going to grow in the near future. However, I think that the next generation of games will also definitely be cross-platform for quite a few years. We might have the most extended cross-generation that we've ever seen. That would be my prediction. And with that in mind, I would imagine that, if a game developer is targeting the PS6 and the PS5, the PS5 has 12-ish gigabytes of memory that usually get allocated toward VRAM-related tasks. So I would imagine that your PS5-ish type settings would probably play extremely well on a 5070 in the near future. So here's what I would say. Well, I would certainly prefer a card to have 16 gigabytes over 12, and we are seeing signs of 12 already causing issues at certain settings. In the vast majority of situations currently, it is still better to have 26% more performance than it is to have the 16 gigabytes of VRAM versus the 12. Ideally, you would have both. And again, I have done a different video where I compare the 9070 against the 5070 in the latest games. And the 9070 is right here in the same kind of pricing ballpark, so that's definitely worth checking out. So if you're willing to consider the AMD option, you might be able to get more performance even than a 5070, along with the 16 gigabytes of VRAM and around the same kind of price point. So worth checking that out. Again, that video will talk more about the pros and cons of AMD versus NVIDIA and all of those sorts of things, because then you have to start factoring all of that in. So I encourage you to maybe watch that as a follow-up video. But if you're on the I'm just going to buy NVIDIA side and you're looking at around the $600 price point, if I was buying an NVIDIA GPU around $600, I would buy the 5070 over the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte. Now, if you want a lower budget card that gets 16 gigabyte, you might look into the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte. And I have been doing some updated testing on that as well and expect some updated head-to-head performance looking at the 9060 XT 16GB against some of these cards. And if that video is not out by the time you're watching this one, you could look at some of my previous testing of the 9060 XT 16GB. It's just that's about a year old, but honestly, you know, newer games doesn't necessarily get that much different results than the older ones, but it's nice to update them with my thoughts on current market pricing, which certainly has changed. All right, hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.